This meeting is being recorded.
It's a great honor to welcome to the show once again, Alexander Boot, conservative intellectual of the first rate. How are you today, Alexander? Welcome to the show.
Very well indeed. Thank you, Chong. I'm not sure about the word intellectual because these days it's mostly used in a pejorative sense. But
but nevertheless, I think we may have touched on this question in our last conversation, but what are some of the qualities that are required in order to be a good conservative, let alone an intellectual conservative?
Well, an essential quality is that follows from the very word conservative. The essential quality is that you want to conserve something, and a conservative is defined by his desire to conserve the cultural, social, political heritage of the Judeo-Christian civilization, which we barely know actually now, because we're living at an age when it's collapsing around us. But nonetheless, that's the only one we've got because it hasn't really been effectively replaced by any other. So in that sense, for example, I'm not sure a conservative has to be a believing Christian, but he certainly has to accept the Christian nature of our civilization and try to preserve it. That for me is the most essential aspect of conservatism. Everything else follows. Above all, it's almost a mantra these days to say that conservatism is not an ideology and is not even a philosophy. That conservatism is a kind of character trait. And that idea, even though it's bandied about a lot, has a lot of attraction for me because I believe in the intuitive basis to any knowledge. That I could almost, in most cases, go so far as to say that all rationalization was post-rationalization. First, we sense the truth of the matter intuitively, and once that sensation has settled within us, we begin to explain it to ourselves in rational terms, to ourselves and others, if we so wish. So, if that's true, then a conservative is characterized by a certain set of intuitive assumptions, not so much by the philosophical post-rationalization thereof, which is why conservatism usually reveals itself not only in politics, but the same man who espouses conservative political causes also has a certain, usually, not invariably, has a certain sense of taste in other things. Music, clothes, even home decoration. I mean, I can tell you a home of a conservative from the home of a lefty at first glance, almost. It's and this is one of those details in which God resides. You can grasp the very end of the thread, pull on it, and unravel the whole bunch.
Mm-hmm. Well, since I'm thinking of segueing into our topic of the hour, so is classical music worth conserving?
Well, this is a wonderful A wonderful question, of course. I mean, and a perfectly legitimate one. But the short answer is yes. But I don't think the short answer actually works in this case. We need a bit of background there. We need to understand what music is, and extrapolating from there what beauty is. Because music does not exist in isolation. Nothing does. Music is an aspect of something greater than itself, and that has been known since Athens, really. Both Plato and Aristotle assigned tremendous significance to music. Beauty to them, I mean, Aristotle, if memory serves, used the term transcendentals, which Plato specifically identified as the truth, goodness, and beauty being inseparable ontological properties of being. And the deficit in one aspect of the triad automatically produces a deficit in the other two. And well, this is Rembrandt, this is not Aristotle. But are you there?
Oh, yeah. I'm just shutting the window. There's some noise coming up from outside. But yeah, you can continue.
And music to them already was the quintessence of beauty. For you know, in Athens and in their schools, music was one of the 4 or 5 compulsory subjects always taught, along with philosophy, rhetoric, logic, and mathematics. You know, and Plato went so far as to say music is a moral law, and not an aesthetic law, but a moral one, specifically. And Aristotle actually believed that musical innovation, especially in the direction of sensuality, more sensual modes like the Dorian mode of music, that musical innovation should be discouraged because it's bound to produce political subversion. So that puts music in a certain context of both aesthetic philosophy and philosophy in general, that it's closely linked to other properties of being. Now, the Greek notion of beauty and therefore of music was subtly different from what I call Western, which is to say Christian music. For them, you know, it was this Juvenile's idea, I mean, the Roman idea of mens sana in corpore sano, a healthy mind and a healthy body. In other words, the perfection of form by itself, as far as they were concerned, conveyed moral and intellectual properties, but moral and intellectual essence. For example, if you look at the statue of Venus de Milo, I mean, it's ineffably beautiful, but what can you say about the content of the sitter, of the model? What kind of a woman was she? Was she sexy? Was she dull? Was she clever? Was she silly? Was she outgoing? Was she introverted? You don't know, and nobody does, because for them the perfection of form by itself conveyed a certain content. Whereas, of course, the Christian civilization is based on the perfect confluence of form and content, because if God can, if God can exist within the breast of a man, then that's your perfect symbiosis. And that explains why music became the quintessential expression of our civilization more than any other art form. For example, in Greece, it was sculpture. It was absolutely essential. It was the quintessence of the Hellenic civilization, because its three-dimensional perfection of form was sufficient. For the Christian civilization, that wasn't enough. It had to be, the content and form had to come together in the perfect symbiosis. And music, of course, does it better than any other art because it's unmediated, because it doesn't depend on the mediation of words as does literature, or of images as does painting, or forms, cast forms as does sculpture. And music, that is Western, which is to say Christian music, started basically in the church. And now we don't know that much. We know a lot about the Greeks' views on music and its importance, but we don't know. But we don't have much in the way of surviving evidence of their music. There are little bits and pieces here or there, but it clearly doesn't represent a major bulk of cultural heritage. Whereas when music moved into the church, it underwent an astounding development. Because if you look at the best sculptures produced in Europe and in the Christian Europe, let's say, for the sake of argument, you look at Michelangelo's or Donatello's sculptures, or even later, you look at some sculpted portraits, let's say by Houdon, the French painter, the French 18th century. Did I say 18th? No, 17th century sculptor. And compare those sculptures with those you can find in Athens or Rome, you can't honestly say that art form has progressed in the interim and rose to a new height. However, if you compare the bits and scraps of Greek music that survive with the work of, let's say, Bach or Beethoven, then we're not talking just about development or progress. We're talking about opening up a whole new universe. So if that is the case, then music represents the highest cultural attainment of our civilization, and also its distillation. It's sort of as Plato put it, it gives wings to imagination. It activates the inner resources of the listener. And in that sense, you can say that music exists within us. And it's the task of the composer and the performer to find it within us and bring it to the surface. A parallel with natural sciences is good, because, for example, Newton didn't invent the first law of thermodynamics. It was already there. He basically found it. He found it and brought it to the surface. The same thing with music. Now, if music is the highest level, it establishes a standard towards which a human spirit should strive. And it sets the bar at a certain level, and any incremental approximation to that bar represents an elevation of spirit. Now, that by itself suggests that music could not be mass art because if you insist that it must be, then you must also believe that everybody is equally capable of achieving the highest or perceiving the highest levels of our culture, which is manifestly not the case. And if you look at music, I don't like saying classical music. I just say music. These days, if you look at the newspapers, usually they have a music section, which typically means pop, and then classical music. It needs to be qualified. I don't do that. Music is music, and if you look at the entire history of Western music, it's more or less, not entirely, but more or less coextensive with the aristocratic period of our civilization. It was created for few by fewer. If you look at the typical audience for a concert by Mozart or Clementi or whoever, 18th century musicians, their audiences were made up of musically educated people, typically musicians themselves, because most aristocrats in those days were musically literate. Can you say musically literate? I'm not sure, but anyway, they were musically advanced. Somebody like Friedrich the Great was an accomplished flutist, for example, and he could actually perform most of the music written for the flute. Even our own Henry VIII wrote Greensleeves, so obviously he had the wherewithal to produce music, and so I would say that, and music survived not on box office receipts in those days, but on patronage, and that was the only way at the time, because if you look at the great musicians of the 18th century, when music was really at its peak, from Bach to, let's say, Mozart and Beethoven, they all survived by patronage, all of them. Beethoven is generally regarded as the first composer who didn't depend on his patrons, but that's simply not true. If you look at his biography, Lichnowsky and all those assorted Austrian noblemen bankrolled him the same way as Mozart and Haydn were. Haydn was in the employ of Esterhazy, for example, and not far from where you are now. And so music occupies its own niche, and it can't be filled by any simplified versions of it. It's the moment music starts depending on box receipts, on mass appeal, it has to compromise, because masses are incapable of raising themselves to the level required to appreciate the classical music properly. And I distinguish between appreciating and liking. I mean, anyone can like a cute melody, let's say by Chopin, for example, but there's a world of difference between liking and appreciating, because you can see, you go to a concert these days, and there are lots of people who really don't know what they're listening to. They applaud names, not performances. A big name can have an off day when even his fingers aren't working properly, but the level of the applause never goes down. It's the same ovation, the same screams and all and all that. And once music becomes musical entertainment, it starts functioning not according to the laws of high spirituality, but according to the laws of the entertainment industry. And then it begins to fall into the same rubric as pop or rap or whatever. And you can hear, I recently I had a conversation with my niece, who is a very nice young lady. And she told me that she liked listening to both classical and pop. And there's nothing wrong with it. I said, yeah, you're absolutely right. There's nothing wrong with it. And you can listen to both. But if you can't physically listen to pop music, that means you can't understand classical music. The two are simply incompatible. Anybody who understands classical music walks out of the room the moment any kind of pop is played. And by the way, vice versa. I remember I once I noticed that today's youngsters experience physical discomfort when listening to classical music, because I remember I used to work in the advertising industry, and I was creative director of an ad agency, and we had a large room where all the designers worked, and they had some kind of pop blaring in the background all day. And I told them that you're welcome to do whatever you want, but when I come in, it needs to be switched off. And they said, well, that means you simply don't like vocal music. I said, you're absolutely wrong. I love vocal music, and I'll prove it to you. So next day, I brought in a CD of some kind of Bach cantata, which is vocal music, and I put it on, and they physically couldn't listen to it. And one very nice girl, very nice, solidly middle-class girl, left the room with a pained expression on her face. She just couldn't do it. But when the masses of humanity start streaming into concert halls, the old world, the old principle of supply demand goes to work, because the masses create their own demand, and the performers who have to depend on the masses for their livelihood actually have to meet that demand. And typically that's achieved by lowering the standard, which is why if you compare the recordings from the 50s, let's say, to those now, to what today's musicians are playing, the contrast is striking. I mean, it's clear that a massive cultural collapse has occurred at some point, because even I'm talking about my lifetime. I'm not talking about the 18th century. Let's say in the 60s or in the 50s. You look at the concert programs, where I remember going to concerts in those days, there were giants there. And now we have entertainers, musical entertainers. We have women who perform semi-naked, sort of relying basically on the same appeal as a pole dancer does. Yu Wang is one bright example. Then there's also this Georgian girl who's extremely richly endowed in the upstairs department, and she shows that over the piano every time. In other words, music no longer appeals to the masses as music should appeal. It becomes a form of entertainment. It's we can go to a concert, or we can go to a dance, or we can go out and have dinner before or after or instead of the concert. and so on and so forth. It has lost its sublime significance as the ultimate expression of our culture.
Well, I remember that Alan Bloom, when he wrote in his book, The Closing of the American Mind.
I was going to mention that because Bloom writes about it extremely well. He says that, but you see, he writes about the pop music, saying that never in the history of mankind has music, and he uses the word music very broadly, not the way I do, because that music had the same kind of significance, because people define themselves by the pop group they prefer. And back in the old days, it was you were the Stones man, I'm the Beatles man. And they were supposed to be a world of difference. But you see, the whole thing is that when music becomes nothing but entertainment, it gradually stops being music. If you look at pop music, let's say in the 30s, you know, your Cole Porters, for example. I mean, it's very simple stuff, but it has all the elements of a musical work. There's a melody, there's a rhythm, there's harmony, and all that. Even if you look at rock and roll at its birth, you know, your Chuck Berry's or your Buddy Holly's or lately Elvis Presley, the Beatles, there was some musical content there, very primitive, very basic, but at least you could discern a melodic line, you could see how it was harmonized. The Beatles eventually started engaging the services of classically trained musicians, so they produced quite involved harmonies and all that. But step by step, the musical content began to disappear, and only the cult aspect of it remained. And these days, if you listen to pop concerts, and I can't, in all honesty, say that I attend a lot of them, or any, as a matter of fact, but with bits and pieces, one here or there, there's no musical content whatsoever. There's this stupefying bass beat in the background, and then incoherent sounds. Sometimes you can discern the three basic chords played on the guitar, but there's no music there. But if you look at the crowd, they're in ecstasy. They're in ecstasy and on ecstasy, if I may, as a rule, because music has sort of become an extension of the pharmacological industry. But so it's clearly a cult, and that's what Bloom wrote about. That the pop music had become a cult, and Bloom wrote that book in the 80s. So about 40 years ago. And since then, things have not improved. They've become much worse. And Bloom has died. Yes, it's but if you look at strangely, musical composition has not disappeared. For example, there is the Scottish composer James Macmillan, whose name will one day be mentioned side by side with Bach's, in my view, who writes absolutely sublime music. There are a few others, but musical performance has deteriorated tremendously. I mean, I remember I was ill about 20 years ago. People didn't think I'd survive. And the chap I knew, an old man and an avid concert goer, collected concert programs, and he started attending concerts in the late 40s. And when I was in hospital, he brought a suitcase full of concert programs to my hospital bed. And I looked, I think it was 1952, something like that, the programs. And Furtwängler was performing all 9 symphonies, all Beethoven symphonies, in one season. But side by side with Furtwängler, who was probably the greatest conductor who's ever lived, you could name half a dozen others. There was your Mengelberg, there was your Bruno Walter, there was Klemperer. They were great conductors. I would say today, there isn't a single conductor in the world who can perform a Beethoven symphony to anything approaching that sort of standard. And that is noticeable decline, not to say collapse.
Mhm. Well, I think I mentioned Bloom because he was reacting to popular music the same way as Socrates reacted to Homeric poetry, in that he believes that it professes a false value system.
Mhm.
I think I would agree in that even though I like some of the pop acts that I follow, I would not see them as paragons of moral virtue either. So is there a difference in value in the moral value system between classical, or what you call music, versus, I guess, entertainment?
Night and day, because classical music appears to the best side of human nature, in that side of human nature in which human nature is divine, if you accept the Christian standpoint. And it pulls a man's spirit up towards heaven. I mean, it can't reach it all the way because it's unreachable, but it can approach it by incremental steps. Whereas pop appeals to human nature at its crudest, coarsest, and most primitive. It appeals to the basic urges, mostly of a sensual kind. And if music pulls a man up, then pop pushes the man down to the most basic carnal, sensual, pagan level. And the difference between classical music and pop is the difference between the Eucharist and cannibalism. It's in both cases there is an implication of eating flesh, but the moral, spiritual, and religious significance of the two acts are rather opposite. And I think it's an apposite comparison, analogy, that pop encourages the worst part of human nature, basically this pagan impulse that exists within us all, and which civilization is there to suppress, or at least to rechannel into a more productive content. And so yes, the moral difference is the difference between two universes. It's not the quantitative difference between similar things, but we're talking about two entirely different entities.
So to mention Bloom again, his other great work, Love and Friendship, it's a wonderful treatise on what those concepts are. And also he laments that contemporary culture has removed the meaning and the significance of the eros. And I think I couldn't agree more in that when I hear all the popular music these days, talking about love and sex as if they're the greatest thing in the world. They actually trivializes it. They simplified the meaning of the eros. So, what are some of the greatest classical musical minds think about this topic?
You mean musical philosophers?
And the composers too.
Well, composers, I personally divide two composers into two categories. There's Bach and there's everybody else. Bach is the universe. It's Bach is the highest level the human spirit has so far reached, and he didn't leave any writings on the subject of music, and in general, great composers very seldom express themselves in the literary form. But Bach, first he revolutionized the music for every instrument that existed at the time, and some that didn't exist, such as the modern piano, because he clearly anticipated the development of the clavier, of keyboard instruments in that direction, and his music, his keyboard music lends itself to the modern piano ideally, which was best demonstrated by Glenn Gould, who I think was the greatest instrumentalist of all time, actually. So Bach wrote on all his compositions, he wrote "The glory is God's," but God shares his glory, and never quite so obviously as in him. It's very interesting to compare the music of Bach's time, and Bach was a culmination of that music, because the contrapuntal music was on the way out as the dominant trend. If you look at the contrapuntal work, it contains many strains that then come together at some point, but the strains are equally important. They are, it's a very pluralistic form, as it were. The implication is that that's how God hears music, or hears different people speaking, because before God, we're all equal. What began to happen in the late 18th century, and certainly in the 19th century, that our culture became more anthropocentric. When people started to proceed from their own feelings and their own emotions more than from the feelings and emotions they ascribed to God. And suddenly music changed technically, that there appeared one dominant voice, presumably, of the composer, and everything else sort of supported in an auxiliary role. Exactly the same is observable in painting, and specifically in perspective, which became the dominant art concept sort of during the Renaissance. Now, people say that before the Renaissance, people didn't know what perspective was, which is simply not true, because, for example, the production sets of Greek plays in Athens that were done in perspective. I mean, it doesn't take a modern mind to realize that that objects become smaller the further away they are from us, that line of vision. But if you look at Byzantine icons and the painting of that time, you'll see that the dominant there is a very flat composition. Moreover, if there's a divine personage involved, then even though he may be in the background, he appears larger than than the figures in the foreground. Again, the implication was the same, that a painter was painting the world not as he saw it, but as he thought God saw it, and God looked down on on the world, and he saw it as a flat picture. But when this egocentric aspect began to appear in art, with the disappearance of Christianity as the dominant force in Western civilization, at that point, perspective became dominant, because again, the artist placed himself at the vantage point of sight, and he no longer tried to show the world as God could have seen it, but he began to show the world as he saw it. And hence perspective is essential, because that's how human eyesight works. You know, and music is a very similar tendency. In general, you'll notice that in various arts, similar tendency occur at roughly the same time, because art doesn't exist in isolation. It reflects the tectonic shifts in civilization. So I would say Bach for sure. And then there are lots of wonderful musicologists. For example, God, my memory for names, Schweitzer, Albert Schweitzer, for example, Dr. Schweitzer. I mean, his writing on Bach specifically, but not only on Bach, on music in general, its significance is absolutely wonderful. There are quite a few, but generally speaking, if you look at modern reviewers of modern musicologists, they sort of proceed from this egalitarian view of beauty being in the eye of the beholder. But like most snappy phrases, it lacks depth. What does it mean? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That means the beauty doesn't exist, because the world has about 8 billion beholders, each with a pair of eyes, or most of them with a pair of eyes. So you're looking at about 15 million eyes or so. And if each of them has its own concept of beauty, that means that this concept is meaningless. You know, it's and if it was, I think, Ralph Waldo Emerson who defined beauty as the handwriting of God. And that, again, it's like most snappy phrases, this one is not exhaustive or especially profound, but it points at the site on which beauty can be found. And without, the moment you take the divine aspect of beauty out, it becomes a purely subjective assessment, which is to say, it doesn't exist objectively. If it's created by God, then it exists outside our perception. And our task is not to define beauty, but to open our minds and our hearts to it, and turn our hearts and minds into sensitive receivers, capable of actually catching the signals transmitted by beauty.
I think when you say that beauty is subjective, it means that there are standards of beauty that I think we all, as appreciators of it, should adhere to. And I think the notion of having standards of beauty is inherently undemocratic. So it I think it is stands in opposition with our democratic culture.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Which is why I have problems with our democratic culture. You're absolutely right. And democracy is the art of averaging.
Mhm.
You take millions of opinions, views, tastes, you toss them into a giant cauldron, get it to boiling point, and hope that the resulting uniform stew will be both nutritious and tasty, which is fine as a general idea, but in practice it doesn't work that way. I mean, that's not how excellence is produced. So yes, beauty, any kind of concept of beauty, any kind of concept of aesthetic excellence is in its very essence anti-egalitarian and elitist,
Mhm.
because the way we are created, some of us are brighter than others, some of us are more sensitive than others, some of us are more capable of the upper reaches of reaching the upper reaches of the cultural atmosphere, and culture is by its nature elitist. And music, as I mentioned before, especially so, because it really was at its peak when it was performed in the salons and of palaces, not when it was got to be performed in the concert halls with 5,000 seats, or on the records reaching millions of people. It's, you're absolutely right that everything I say is profoundly undemocratic, and I think I should be put on the pyre.
Yeah, harkening back to your comparison between the value system that classical music professes versus what pop professes, I'm thinking about how how we've changed, at least Western culture has changed from viewing politics in a platonic worldview, as in politics is something to aspire to a Machiavellian worldview, in that politics is a reflection of human nature. And I think in fact the profilation of democracy and liberalism and modernity even is a product of, I guess, the Machiavellian profanation profanation of politics. So I wonder, is it possible to return to, I guess, the Platonic conception of politics?
It's a tough one. I'm not sure it is. Uh, well, if you talk about Platonic perception of politics in the abstract, it's one thing. If you look at his specific prescriptions for politics, for example, in laws, or especially in laws, but also in the Republic, his idea was, I would say, not so much undemocratic as totalitarian.
Mhm.
He essentially divided people into three classes. There was the top class, and there were your philosopher kings. There was the bottom class, the slaves, and in the middle were the guardians, the people who protected the uppers from the lowers, and kept the lowers down. It's I would say that the Platonic idea of the state was realized in the USSR and Nazi Germany more than in any other. However, if you talk about the Platonic idea of politics as being an ontological property of man, then that's a different matter. And I think that particular pitch has been queered by the past 3 centuries irreversibly. I think politics has lost its moral constituent. It has become not so much immoral as amoral, and in that sense, it's probably Machiavellian, because Machiavelli kind of removed the moral aspect from politics and sort of and reduce it to whatever works, you know. And but again, there too, one detects a certain regression, sort of incremental, gradual regression, because when politics is based on the concept of pragmatism, whatever works, we will look at what's worked in the past, and we kind of adapt it to today's realities. If you remove the moral or the religious or the spiritual aspect from it, eventually what works stops working. You know, whatever works doesn't work, meaning that the very pragmatism was sacrificed at the altar of this minute's expediency. You know, if you look at today's politicians, they're incapable of thinking in long-term categories. They think from one election to the next, and that leads essentially to uniformity. It's very interesting because modernity prides itself on raising the individuality to a new plateau. But in fact, modernity promotes uniformity more than any other period in history ever did. And if you look at most Western countries and compare the political aspirations of their parties, of their main parties, the differences are negligible. You know, it's all become nothing but the corrupt quest for gaining and keeping power and nothing else. I mean, really, everything else is just virtual reality. They create this fog of false values and hide behind it. But what they hide behind it is a naked quest for power at all costs. And I would say that the democracy enfeebles the individual more than any other autocracy ever did. By democracy, I don't mean a country with a polity with a democratic ingredient. I think that is very advisable. But I'm talking about this total or totalitarian democracy of one person, one vote across the board, and with a constantly expanding franchise, and with no counterbalances coming from other forms of power. Like, for example, in Britain, where this ideal political arrangement was achieved in the 19th century, with the House of Commons representing the democratic aspect, with the Crown being above it, and with the House of Lords mitigating the conflict between the two, making sure that neither end of the seesaw shot up under the weight of the other. Now that has been destroyed specifically by this democratic impulse, and now what we have is the dictatorship of the commons in Britain. The lords have, for all intents and purposes, been eliminated as a power mechanism, and certainly the crown, that happened to the crown a long time ago. So democracy, when it's not unchecked, eventually leads to its opposite. In my view, it begets something which is the opposite of the democratic desiderata, specifically, well, what somebody like Tocqueville would call the tyranny of the majority, but it's not even the tyranny of the majority. It's the tyranny of a very small elite speaking on behalf of the majority, but not really representing its interests.
Mhm. I believe in Poland, there's this great political thinker, Ryszard Legutko, who wrote that book, The Demon in Democracy. And I think everything you just said is something that he expressed similarly in his book, although I guess with much more articulation. I think the book itself has made much influence in Europe, although it would be very offensive to any American. So I wonder if you're aware of that book at all.
I'm not. What's it called again?
The Demon in Democracy. That's the English title. The person is Ryszard Legutko. I believe, yeah, he used to be part of the Solidarity movement in opposition to communism, but then he saw that the triumph of liberal democracy reminds him way too much of the old regime, so to speak.
Well, yes. Well, I don't know how, because the old regime was aristocratic. But in a way, I suppose that's true, because coming to the fore in modern democracies is a very homogeneous elite that may divide itself into different parties, but they overlap tremendously in everything. But there have been quite a few people who have written on this subject. My view, which I have I've actually written a book on that. My view is that the modernity was adumbrated and created by an entirely new human type. You know, we look at the civilizations of the past, and we think that we're looking at something out of which our modern man has evolved. But I think that transition was not evolutionary but revolutionary. That the house is still standing, but is inhabited by entirely different residents, and which is why these days it's getting more and more difficult for young people in particular to appreciate the historic events of the past, because they try to apply the criteria of our time, and they simply don't apply, which is why this horrible subversion of history that's underway in all Western countries, when the entire history of Western civilization is reassessed in the context of the critical race theory. You know, that it's all nothing but oppression, suppression, depression, and and so forth. It's no, I will look up this book. It sounds interesting, but
I'll send it to you. I'll send you the link to it. So, final question. How would you, I guess, reconcile this, I guess, this disdain for today's governmental and academic and etc. elite with, I guess, your fondness for things that are elitist in nature, say classical music and high art and all that?
well, you can't reconcile it on the sort of demographic or social level, en masse, because these things are reconcilable. However, on the individual level, I mean, you're still free to do as you please, and specifically, in terms of music, there are recordings. So you can listen to great music played by great musicians through the same medium as we're using now. You just you go on Google and then on YouTube, and you can get anything you want practically. So a certain atomization is inevitable here. That people who think and feel the way I do find themselves as sort of pariahs, speaking broadly on the cultural and social level. However, there's still enough of us to sustain each of us individually through personal association, and it's still possible. It's getting increasingly difficult to publish books that say the sort of things I say. I mean, I've managed about half a dozen, but not for the last 6 or 7 years. But I have my own blog, which is read by quite a few thinking people. Write the odd article. So it's possible to carve out a niche for yourself individually, but I don't think it's possible to have any significant effect on society for people like us, because the society is a juggernaut, and it's like a runaway train. Once it keeps going, and it's extremely hard to stop. Culturally, politically, you can have all sorts of upheavals. You can create a coup d'etat, for example, and have a violent overthrow of a government. But culturally, bucking a cultural trend is extremely difficult, and it always involves, any kind of cultural revolution always either precedes or immediately follows a political one. You'll notice that throughout history. You look at the Reformation, for example, was a revolutionary outburst, and it immediately created a new culture of sorts. The American Revolution was a cultural, the French Revolution certainly was. I mean, and then aesthetic and cultural criteria got to be reassessed. But Aristotle was absolutely right, linking cultural innovation with political subversion, because the link does exist. So like I say, individually one can survive as to use a fashionable term as an influencer. One really can't. like you're talking about Alan Bloom. Alan Bloom was a major thinker, really. I mean, that book created a tremendous splash when it came out. I think it was '84 or something like that. And everybody talked about it, everybody read about it. Now, who knows it now? I mean, you do, I do, and maybe a few others. But but his concept, I remember, it impressed me no end when I first read it. Less so now, but he was he made an absolutely staggering discovery, saying that this so-called open mind, which is held as the ultimate virtue today, effectively leads to the closing of the mind. You know, so it's all right to have an open mind as long as your brain doesn't fall out, as they say, and he showed this mind-numbing conformity and uniformity of American students of his time, and he was a professor at Chicago University, which was probably the hotbed of intellectual conservatism in those days. And so my views on society in general are extremely pessimistic, but my views on the individual are not. You know, I do believe in eternal life. I do believe in individual salvation, and therein lies a tremendous hope for all of us. I can't see any other hope of a more earthly kind.
On that bittersweet note, I suppose. Thank you very much, Alexander Boot, for joining the show once again.
Thank you.
I wish you all the best, and do take care of yourself.
You too.